Hello. So yesterday, I think it was yesterday, I talked about a story from Milarepa, a story of where he'd had some insight. And I thought that'd be quite nice to talk about another story from Milarepa. I was thinking of it just because this morning me and Bodhivajra have been to Tesco's. And I was noticing when I was in Tesco, so I hadn't been out for a couple of weeks. I really wanted to go shopping, even in Tesco's. And I noticed when I was in there that I was really starting to crave quite a lot of things. All sorts of food that I wouldn't normally be drawn to. And I realised that there was a feeling in me of almost like I might never have it again. If I don't get it now, it might never be available. So there is I think there is a feeling around at the moment for people, and that yes, that we're somehow being denied. We're not being denied, but there can be this false feeling that we are somehow, if we don't buy it now, we might never get it, or something like that. Maybe it's a substitute for being denied our liberty in some way. So anyway, it reminded me of another Milarepa story. And on this occasion, Milarepa was going for a walk. I think he'd had a premonition actually in his dreams or that morning that he was going to meet someone that was going to be a very special disciple of his. So anyway, he's near a river and along comes a youth on this beautiful horse, and this youth is magnificently dressed. He's obviously from a very wealthy home. And Milarepa says, could you take me across the river, please? It's a bit deep, and I need a ride across. Well, of course, the youth, seeing this disreputable-looking beggar, who, is probably pretty smelly, actually, and barely dressed in any rags, even. He says, "Oh no, I can't possibly take you across the river. I'm busy. Haven't got time for you." So off he trots. And Milarepa miraculously appears on the other side of the river before the youth has even arrived there. So, of course, the youth realises at that point that Milarepa is a realised being. He must be enlightened or something. What other explanation can there be? How did he get to the other side of the river? So he prostrates to Milarepa and says, "Please, I want to be your disciple." So Milarepa doesn't take him too seriously at that point. And in his regret at what he's done, the youth starts offering Milarepa all the things that he's dressed in. And, he offers him, say, his warm hat, for example. And Milarepa says something like, "Why would I need your warm hat? I've got meditation to keep me warm." So as you may or may not know, in Tibet, they one of the meditation practices that they did, people that lived in the mountains, and I think this took quite a lot of training, they would practice what was called tumo or dumo. And it was where they were able to generate fire in their belly, not literal fire, but this incredible warmth that would keep them warm, because basically they'd be there in a cotton robe, nothing else, and maybe snowed in for months of the year, and they'd be perfectly all right like that. So he says, I don't need your hat. I can keep myself warm with meditation. So he says, well, surely you want this beautiful sword. You've got a sword and it's encrusted with jewels. No, I don't need. What would I do with a sword? I've got the sword of wisdom. Why would I need a pathetic sword like that? So he goes through all these garments. It's quite a long story, and he offers him his horse, and then he says, well, look, I've got a sister that you can marry. You must want a companion, and so on. No, he doesn't want any of it. And yes, eventually the youth realises he's got absolutely nothing that Milarepa could ever want. And what relevance does this have to us? Well, I mean, I do feel very inspired by Milarepa. You can see this Rupa behind me. The Rupas of Milarepa are, well, they're unusual Rupas in that they're not beautiful young Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. There he is emaciated, you know, you can see all his ribs. And he has a hand to one ear. You could interpret that as he's listening to reality. He's listening to the silence and to the presence of nature around him. But also, he's well known for singing songs of realization. They probably weren't actually very tuneful. Maybe they were chanting. It was more like chanting. And there are two, actually it's in one fat volume now because there's recently been another translation of the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa. And they are quite fascinating. I mean, they're not necessarily an easy read because the practices he does are not that easy to understand sometimes. But basically, he lived a life of simplicity. And the reason that he did that is because in his youth, he created the death. He caused the death of quite a lot of people to get his own back, if you like, on his aunt and uncle who had basically swindled him and his family and treated them like servants. He'd swindled them out of his inheritance. So anyway, Milarepa's mother persuaded him to learn black magic, and with that black magic he caused mayhem and caused a number of deaths. And after that happened in his youth, he realised that the only way that he was ever going to, well, not end up in hell realms, in other words, get very unpleasant rebirths for a very, very many of them too, was to gain enlightenment in one lifetime, in this lifetime. And so he gave up everything. He found a teacher, Marpa, who really put him through a lot of misery, really, as a way of purifying all this dark wickedness that he had done. And then he spent the rest of his life meditating in caves and completely free of any desires or wants for anything of the material world. And yes, I could say, well, I do deeply believe that there is no spiritual life without renunciation. And I don't think renunciation is a very popular word today. It's very hard, I think, for us to renounce anything much because we live in a culture, particularly in this country, where we are encouraged to spend money all the time. Our economy depends on it. So yes, you know, if people aren't buying things, the government starts getting very anxious about it. But actually, because of that, we're more and more putting stuff in landfill. You know, we're more and more unable to make do amend, or even to just use things for years and years. You know, something new comes out, and that's what we want. So we're programmed in that way, and it's terrible for the planet, but it's also terrible for our own development because wanting things all the time, you know, as you know, craving never ends. There is no end to craving. When you get what you thought you really, really wanted, you find that very shortly you want something else. So, you know, Milarepa, okay, we're never going to live as Milarepa, but actually his teachings are very profound in terms of encouraging us towards simplicity and towards contentment, to yes, not to be always grabbing the next thing. So yeah, that's another story from Milarepa, well worth reading. And And that's all for today. So I will perhaps see you tomorrow. Bye.